Next up, 1619 creator Nikole Hannah-Jones tells WNYC's Jami Floyd how promises made during Reconstruction motivated Dr. King's civil rights movement.
So when we think about the civil rights movement, what was the civil rights movement trying to do? What was Dr. King trying to do? Dr. King was really trying to enforce and lead to the enforcement of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. After slavery, Black Americans were promised equal protection before the law. We were promised full citizenship in this country, and we were promised the right to vote. And yet, 100 years after the end of the Civil War, Black Americans were having to fight, were dying, were being assassinated, were marching in order to really fulfill our constitutional rights. And that's what Dr. King was doing. So when we think about that through line, as you were saying. So I'm 44 years old. I was born in 1976. And just a decade before I was born, it was legal to discriminate against me and everyone like me because I descended from American slavery. We kind of, I think, in our mind, somehow see images of black and white photos and think that this was so long ago. Mm-hmm. But I'm part of the first generation of Black people in the history of this country who was born with full rights of citizenship. That's not a long legacy. That's actually a very, very near legacy. That's my parents, your parents. They were born into a system of legal apartheid. And so it shouldn't be shocking then, understanding that we are part of that first generation that had full rights of citizenship, that we're still struggling, that we haven't been able to make up for 350 years of slavery and legal discrimination.
And it's not ancient history, it's our history.
No, it's very, very present. I mean, we just lost, John Lewis and someone who fought against apartheid in this country. This is not ancient history. There are still living people in our society right now who experience where it was legal to discriminate against Black Americans in every aspect of American life, where we lived, where we went to school, where we could shop, whether we could, where we would sit in public transportation, whether we could use a public library. This is one generation behind me. And yet the way that we're taught this is, hey, Dr. King marched, we passed laws, and everything is okay. And then we even freeze Dr. King. We freeze him in 1963 with the March on Washington. And we ignore King in 1967, in 1968 when he was assassinated, who was much more radical than that message in 1963, because that King in 1963, and even then it's just one part of his speech, the speech about, little Black children and little white children and the content and the character. But we ignore the part of that speech where he talks about, the check that was returned marked insufficient funds. We ignore the part of that speech that talks about the debt that this country owes. And that's really what my work is trying to get us to focus on, what America still owes and what America has refused to address.
We always talk about the founding documents, the spirit of the founding documents, and you mentioned the Reconstruction Amendments, which have never been truly realized. Thinking again about the spirit of the 1619 Project and Dr. King's mission, what aspect, what spirit, what part of our getting back to the trajectory would you want to capture in this moment?
Yeah, I think my opening essay for the 1619 Project is about democracy. Yes. And it is about how it is actually Black Americans through centuries of resistance, often bloody, violent resistance being visited upon us, who have turned our country into as close of a democracy as it is. What's been so fascinating about this moment that we're in with Trump and him not wanting to concede the election is many white Americans were assured that our democracy is 250 years old. So therefore our democracy can withstand this assault. But that's not true. Our democracy is really only 50 years old. We did not have a true democracy until 1968. Of course, 1965 was a passage of the Voting Rights Act, and 1968 is when we ended the last discrimination in the law. That is a very young democracy, and it is a very tenuous democracy, because that democracy, of course, only came through a bloody civil rights struggle that was led by Dr. King, and ultimately that cost Dr. King his life, as well as many other martyrs of the movement. So if we think about that, then we understand how precious and vulnerable our democracy is, and that Black Americans, like Dr. King, were our founding fathers as well, because they were the founding fathers of a true democracy, not democracy on paper, but democracy in fact. When you have large segments of your population who are brutally and violently denied the right to vote, you are not a democracy. It is Black people who have always believed in those founding ideals, who have expanded democracy for all marginalized people, and yet we do not get the credit for that. And when we think about the civil rights movement, the way that we're taught that is somehow that this was a movement for Black Americans. This was a movement to democratize America, not just about Black rights. This was about whether we were going to live up to the Reconstruction Amendments, which expanded democracy and rights for all Americans, and particularly marginalized Americans of all kinds. That's what I wish we would think about when we think about Dr. King's legacy, and the legacy of all of those, both famous and little known Americans who fought that this wasn't just about Black people fighting for their rights, but it was about Black people fighting for democracy for all of us.